Hello, everyone. As you're filing in, welcome. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 701st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Jill H. Casid, Pamela Sneed, Kevin Quiles Bonilla, and Ksenia M. Soboleva. We are thrilled to welcome poet Phoebe Osborne here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. A theorist, historian, and practicing artist, Jill H. Casid is professor of visual studies in the departments of art history and gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Casid is currently completing Necrolandscaping, the first part of a two-book project on form at the edges of life. Casid is the author of Scenes of Projection, Recasting the Enlightenment Subject, and Casid's artwork has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including in recent exhibitions at Sign and Symbols, the Ford Foundation Gallery, and Documenta 15. Pamela Sneed is a New York-based poet, performer, and visual artist. She's the author of Imagine Being More Afraid of Freedom Than Slavery, Kong and Other Works, Sweet Dreams, and Funeral Diva, which was featured in the New York Times and won the 2021 Lambda Lesbian Poetry Award. She has also won the Black Queer Art Mentorship Award, a BOFO residency, and was a finalist for the New York Theater Workshop's Golden Harris Award. Sneed has published in the Paris Review, Frieze Art Forum, the Academy of American Poets, and more, and her visual work has been featured in group shows at Leslie Lohman and currently at the Ford Foundation. Interdisciplinary artist Kevin Quiles Bonilla was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico. His work has been presented internationally. He has participated in multiple distinguished artist in residence programs. And in 2017, he received the Emerging Artist Award from the John F. Kennedy Center. Most recently, he's presented his work at the Brooklyn Museum, Queens Museum, Daedalus Foundation, and elsewhere. He explores ideas around power, colonialism, and history with his identity as context. He currently lives and works between Puerto Rico and New York. And our host today, New York-based writer and art historian, Dr. Ksenia M. Soboleva, specializes in queer art and culture. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, with a dissertation titled Fragments, Art, AIDS, and Lesbian Identity in the United States. Her writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Bomb, Hyperallergic, Art Agenda, and various exhibition catalogs. She has curated several exhibitions, including currently This Has Happened, which is up now at Tapete Volante. You should go see it. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to pass it over to you, Ksenia.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you to everyone at the Rail for making this possible. It's always such a pleasure. Congrats, Jill, Kevin, Pamela, on this beautiful, very queer exhibition that was curated by Jessica Cooley and Anne Fox and features 14 artists in total, and you're 3 of them. And as I understand it, it's really a continuation of a much larger project that began during the pandemic to consider the ways in which COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement exposed how certain lives are deemed disposable, as of course was also the case with the AIDS crisis, and these disposable lives are usually part of marginalized communities, queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disability, drug users, sex workers. And the exhibition, I think, explores how different forms of marginalization intersect. And the question at the heart of the show, as it was posed in the press release, is what makes a life livable? And something that I actually think about a lot precedes that question by one step, and it's the question, what makes a life? And it's when something is considered a life that it's worth caring for and mourning, right? And our society is structured in such a way that if someone is unhoused and dies from drug overdose, the death goes unnoticed as the life went unnoticed as well. And the implication, of course, is that this person had already thrown their life away. They had already disposed of it. And so it's not that we are disposing of it as a society. So it takes away responsibility to not consider something a life, right? Or a full life. And actually, Carolyn, maybe we can start the slideshow and show some exhibition views. I really encourage everyone to see it. It's a beautiful, beautiful exhibition. But I wanted to start by asking all three of you to talk a little bit about the work that you're showing in this exhibition and how it relates to this idea of the disposable. Jill, maybe you want to start?
Sure. Well, I've been working for a long time. I would say, my photo practice started with the AIDS crisis. I am certainly part of that generation, having lost an uncle very early. I'm quite convinced my father's not being rescued in a swimming pool in Colorado Springs. In Colorado Springs, it feels like a place name that's important to mention right now after the terrorist shooting at Club Q, because the transcripts of the trial discussed my father as too brown, too gay to be rescued. And I think that the interest in this film technology, the Polaroid SX70 that was introduced in 1972 and has that occulted sort of unheard E and SEC70. It was the first film to condense into the same apparatus the possibility of taking, making, and socially sharing an image. And yet those disgorged images are not only vulnerable originals, but designed to be shared and discarded. They're themselves described as throwaway, cheap film, and yet it's profoundly a queer technology, not least in its having been marketed as the swinging camera to a generation of queer subjects, but it also points to a lost archive of the kinds of images that one would take, the intimate images of all kinds of sex acts that you would never be able to send to the local developer without it being cause for microsurveillance. And we shouldn't forget that the criminalization of homosexuality is not that distant. So the two pieces in the show, one installation on a 16-foot long wooden support structure that I want to do a shout out here to, I don't know if she's in the room, but Sylvie Rosenthal, who worked with me to fabricate this quite delicate light wood support piece that materially and in its form echoes the boardwalk. That's the conveyance infrastructure that familiar to many from Fire Island, that island that Esther Newton described as America's first gay and lesbian town, that has I don't know if anyone knows Tom Bianchi's Fire Island Pines Polaroids. Bianchi claimed in the introduction to the work taken from the time the Polaroid SX70 was introduced in 1972 to the beginnings of what is retrospectively understood as the beginnings of the AIDS crisis in the early 80s, he describes himself as the world's largest consumer of Polaroid film. Whether that was really true or not, it's certainly the case that it's a throwaway, disposable, delicate, easily damaged film that I am hoping materially indexes lives designated prematurely, and you articulated that so beautifully, Ksenia, what is considered a life worth supporting. The piece that has 28 original Polaroids arranged on the surface and bare and exposed, so they're not protected in the gallery space. And I want to thank the Ford Foundation Gallery and director Lisa Kim and the curators who I think are here, Jessica Cooley and Anne Fox, for allowing me to show them here the way they were meant to be shown. The piece showed first at the Chazen Museum of Art in Madison, Wisconsin, and I wasn't allowed there to show it without a protective layer of plexiglass. But the exposure here is meant to pose the very serious question of what are the infrastructures for our intimacies not just with each other, but what are considered non-human species. So what does it take to live free, live with the possibilities for sexual freedom with more than one virus, more than one pathogen. So HIV/AIDS, that's still a crisis. Now the novel coronavirus, and the World Health Organization just today renamed monkeypox Mpox. So I mean, along now with Mpox. But the piece Spirochetes of Contact takes its name from the form, the spiraling hairs of the Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the primary pathogen of Lyme. And this work that was done over a period of 5 years on Fire Island, I thought I was just working in the wake of an AIDS crisis that isn't over, and it became more and more obvious that Fire Island is also the epicenter of Lyme disease. And many argue that it's not only more virulent among those understood as women, but also among those who have sex with women. As you'll see, the film varies tremendously in terms of its resolution. And I was also really interested in the ways that it pulls away from representation and asks more of the viewer, who has to bend over to see these quite small images and also then fantasize, fill in, project. While it is an installation of what would be understood as still film, I think that one of the exciting things about this moment, among many, is opening the question of what is photography after the end of photography. And there's a way in which the raking shadow from the lights above give you this marvelous shadow grid underneath that might also evoke a film strip and give you a sense of a film that's stilled in the ways that we associate stillness with death. And to your question of what is a life, photography has so often been associated with not just stillness, but also with deathliness. And what would it mean to agitate for livable life via a throwaway technology that's also still, but might be activated by our bending over and peering into it. And then just quickly, the film that was done on commission from the Ford takes that throwaway and pushes it even further. So the piece entitled Throwout is animated by an envelope that I found among the papers left to me by my great aunt, who was my queer guide to all things in life. I don't think I would have survived without that queer connection to someone of a quite other generation. And among her papers was an envelope that was in one direction, it was written letters dash throw out, and then the other direction letters throw away. And the film projection takes that message, so uses the significance of throw out as to discard, and connects it immediately to the throw length of projection, and what it might take to understand ourselves as proximate and close to death, mortality, but also those marked for death, and the ways that it activates what I'm understanding as melancholy as medium, that is not a feeling, but a relation. So what does it take for us to hold on to the active, vibrant presence of the dead, and to not let go until there's justice and reparation? At some point, I'd love to show a clip of the film that was realized with the amazing Jack Kellogg, who I don't know whether he's here, but this may not be the moment because I want to make sure that others have a chance to describe work that I'm just so honored to be in conversation with Pamela Sneed and Kevin Quiles Bonilla.
Thank you so much, Jill. And yes, we'll definitely play a clip from the film. Pamela, maybe we can go to you next. And
Sure. Yeah, all the work in the show, I mean, I think, you know, it's been in gestation for a long time because, you know, if people know my work, like Funeral Diva, which was a book I published with City Lights in 2020, and it's done very well, and it was covered by the Times and, you know, a lot of different places, and basically, you know, the standpoint is like a Black lesbian who's kind of like grieving you know, the loss of her friends, like all my poet friends who very much, you know, shaped me, you know, all Black and queer women and men who were felled by AIDS and felled by cancer. And I started that book like 20 years ago. And I mean, it's gone through a lot of different incarnations, but the seed of it was basically losing like my best friend to AIDS. And that's Donald Woods. And so basically, you know, I mean, I was writing about this before anybody was really talking about it. I remember, you know, talking to a publisher and saying that we have to address this, you know, and we have to address the AIDS crisis. Like, I was a person who never really got over it. I was very shaped by all of those people, and that they weren't documented. And so part of like after doing Funeral Diva, and I also had a solo show this summer at Laurel Gitlin Gallery. And but part of like what I've done is I started to render a lot of the men from other countries, Asado Saint, Donald Woods, who was my close friend, Colin Robinson, Craig Harris, Essex Hempel, are all part of, like, if you can zoom in, like that's Craig Harris, who worked on the front lines of GMHC in the early days of the crisis. And then there's the Mourning series, which is a series of collages that I did after the Tree of Life shooting. What is it, at that synagogue in Philadelphia? Am I correct? And basically, you know, I'm responding a lot through art to things that are happening, you know, in the world. A lot of violence, a lot of people who are disappeared, who are not documented. You know, there's also the people from Buffalo that were shot in that the top shooting, basically, that were killed by a white supremacist, and like earlier this year. And so basically, you know, again, like it's all people who are not really represented. Like, you know, part of my premise is that I want, you know, people to be able to go to a gallery and see people that they would not ordinarily see, you know. Part of the problem with like documenting some of the things that are happening with the shootings is that you know, there's like 1 week of news and then the people disappear, you know, they're not seen again. And so like rendering them in watercolor is a way to say that they exist, as a way to kind of confront the viewer, to say that mourning is part of our lives, and yeah, and to not participate in the erasure. And so, and then also I think I have like Jalen Walker, who's in the other corner, and he was shot, I think in Ohio and killed by police, young man, like 100 shots, you know. And so, yeah, so a lot of this wall is about rendering those who have not been rendered. So it's a way of honoring, it's a way of making visible, it's a way of addressing the unspoken. It's activism. It's saying that, you know, these people exist and that they're important. Yeah. And so, yeah, not to the theme of the show, you know, not disposable.
Yeah.
You know, and I definitely feel like, you know, there's no place that you could go in New York and see the people, you know, from Tops Buffalo being rendered, you know, or even, you know, all the men from other countries, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And that's the writing collective. Yeah.
It's interesting to think of your work in terms of the politics of visibility, and then in dialogue with Jill's work, there is a holding back of visibility, and they're just like different queer strategies. And if I'm not mistaken, Pamela, your artistic practice started in art therapy, right? So there's also a direct relationship to the process of mourning. And I want to talk about that more, but first, let's go to Kevin.
Yes. Hi everyone. Yeah, before I just want to echo some of what was said before, but I just want to say that I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Ksenia, for facilitating this space, and just I'm incredibly honored to just be speaking with Jill and with Pamela, who I admire not only as artists but also as scholars. So yeah, just I'm very honored to be presenting and speaking with you. So yeah, the piece that I'm presenting at the exhibition is titled Carryover, Blue Tarp in Vega Alta. It is part of a series that I consider ongoing with the same name, and it started in 2018. And in this series, I'm directly, I was interested in engaging bodily through my body with blue tarp. And this material in particular has a very specific meaning, and I really do believe that it became sort of an iconographic object and material in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. That's where I was born and raised. This piece in particular was shot in Vega Alta, which is the town where I was born and raised in, and this is the plot of land that is right in front of my house. The banana trees were planted by my father. So it all holds like a very special and very intimate context to me. But to give more of a general context around the blue tarp, so these tarps were given to the population in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria passed, specifically to those who had severe damage in their homes right after the passing of the hurricane, whether it was missing parts of roofs or missing parts of walls. And it was meant to represent and be this temporary solution that would then become this full terms solution. But unfortunately, you know, as we kind of saw through like the passing of the weeks right after the hurricane passed through the island, you know, that the help never arrived. And what happened really was that the treatment of the islanders, not only by the Puerto Rican government, but also the US government, sort of allowed for our existence, centuries-long existence as a colony of the United States, sort of come back to the surface. And so I was really interested in working with this material and sort of engaging in it with my body, thinking of it sort of what happens when the body then becomes the structure that needs some sort of protection. So I I try to cover my face, for example, not necessarily to become anonymous, but more so to make a reference to a collective, and I think I do that because of my current lived experience, as a part of the Puerto Rican diaspora. So I live between Puerto Rico and the United States, and I sort of constantly think of the different um, uh, privileges and non-privileges and outcomes and questionings that comes with inhabiting that threshold. For example, very recently with the midterms elections, I kept thinking about how, I am voting, but, for example, my entire family who's still back in the island, they don't have that privilege. Yeah, I also wanted to include some additional pieces of this series. This was actually the first one that I produced in 2018, and it was um, Old San Juan. It is right in front of one of the colonial walls of Old San Juan that were built when Puerto Rico was under the possession of Spain. And if you can go to the next one, please. Thank you. Yeah, this next one, I really wanted to bring it into the conversation here in particular. So this one, I was also motivated to not just focus on documenting these performances on sites only on the island, but also on the US, not only to sort of talk about this very personal lived experience, but also to reference the really big exodus that happened on right after the passing of Hurricane Maria. Something like around 200,000 people migrated to the United States because there simply were no resources on the island for a really extended amount of time. This one in particular, I did it at the Chelsea Piers. And it was in 2019. This was a very specific year, it's the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. At the time, I was doing it while I was doing a performance residency at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art. And I remember that when I was presenting it to a lot of my colleagues and my friends, one of the questions that would arise a lot was, but what is the connection between the Chelsea Piers and then the tarps? And what drew me to make this specific connection was researching footage of the photography or film footage of Sylvia Rivera while she was living at the Chelsea Piers. And also watching the works of artists like Sasha Wardzel, who also uses this film footage of Sylvia at the Piers, or artists like Tuesday Smiley, who both presented at the 2019 exhibition Nobody Promised You Tomorrow at the Brooklyn Museum. Tuesday also created this piece that was titled Hudson River Jordan. And it was meant to be a flag representing different objects that spoke about Sylvia and her referring to the Hudson River as the River Jordan, and also included a blue tarp. So I was really interested in how this material sort of appeared not only through temporality, but also through different intersections. And it also sort of made me not only think about the history that I was researching as a Puerto Rican, but also the history that I was researching as a queer person, and I feel that it kind of creates a thread, with also the works that Pamela and Jill are presenting on the exhibition, with these notions of the archiving of a community, the archiving of a site, of a specific site that became a sort of safe haven for a specific community. The last thing I wanted to mention, and then was something very interesting that has happened with the passing of time. The first photograph that I took was 4 years ago. Is how the site in itself obviously changes really quickly. This piece, this location in particular where I took it, was right next to where now the David Hammond's piece is installed. And yeah, I remembered, I took that photograph. And then about like a week or two afterwards, it was completely covered with like ads from the Whitney saying art is coming soon here, referring to the David Hammond's piece. And then with the previous picture, which was the one in Old San Juan, I actually was just now this past week for the holidays on the island, and I was going to San Juan, and I passed through that same location, and it's now fully covered with like construction materials. I don't know if it's for restoration or, but yeah, it's simply just not, people are not able to access that specific location. And then lastly, the piece that is at the show, that whole vegetation that appears on the piece, that is also no longer there. That plot of land belonged to someone, and a few holidays ago when I went back, it was all gone, including all the banana trees and everything. So it's also a record of our specific moment in time, and yeah, just I'm incredibly honored to have this piece, be a part of this amazing show.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And it's also it's the poster for the show.
Yeah, no, I actually didn't know about that. I saw it at the end of the show. Oh, great, amazing.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. I think all three of you touch upon the fact that times of crisis are usually allowed to happen. The AIDS crisis is something that was allowed to happen, the COVID-19 pandemic, Maria, Lyme's. And I think that there is this tragic irony in the fact that the planet is in the worst state it's ever been, right? But at the same time, more spaces and platforms are slowly given to marginalized voices. And so it's almost like, okay, now that the world is crumbling, you freaks and perverts and losers can fix it. And of course, this is
which is more of the extraction, right? So, absolutely, which I think, goes directly to your question about the tensions or would seem to be tensions between this practice of making visible versus withholding. And
Exactly.
I'd love to say more on that, but I just wanted to add that I think it's also about negotiating the extraction of our creativity and ingenuity, and how to block that while practicing care for each other.
But also this urge to fix, to get over something, the fixation on happiness, as Sarah Ahmed, of course, has beautifully articulated in The Promise of Happiness, is a very heteronormative tendency. And Jill, I think your work also explores what would it mean to let it crumble, let it burn, and exist in this dystopian landscape of our own doing. But on the one hand, it's very easy to say that and write a paper about it. But at the same time, if I drop this coffee cup right now, I will clean it up. So I guess I'm interested to hear you all speak about, how do theory and lived experience come together, and how do you navigate the sort of refusal, but also desire to exist in a certain world?
Well, I have a couple of things. It's not necessarily to that point, but it is a little bit to that point. And one, I was thinking about like the film Disclosure, and somebody said, with more visibility, there's actually more danger. You know what I mean? So, so we get more rights, but then we also, in a way, it makes us exposed to more danger, So there's that kind of like duality. And I'm really struggling with this moment in terms of like, film and all these sort of reckonings, where I go, like, they ignored, slavery for 100 years. And now, people are like, oh, it's profitable. Now we're going to tell all these stories. And the bottom line is that I feel gutted. Like I go, on one hand, I'm happy, like, to go to museums and have all these experiences and feeling seen. And sometimes it feels like, more authentic than others, but other times it feels like exploitative, it just feels like, oh God. And then it also doesn't, it's like, well, I want to watch a film and, to sort of relax, and I want to see, Black people in it. And then it's like, the Till story. And it's just sort of like, oh, do I have to like relive this? And so I guess there's a lot, I have a lot of ambivalence about this moment. And then also I feel like, I guess I feel suspicious that basically like a lot of the visibility has to do with like the economy, like in the sense of that basically, just getting queer dollars, you know what I mean, or getting, Black dollars. And or even like I made a joke, when Obama was in office, and I said, Lincoln freed the slaves, but Obama freed the gays. And it's just kind of like, and of course, that's not a reality, but I'm just saying that like it's all, I feel like we're just products, being moved around. So
Yeah.
I don't necessarily.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
that's
it relates to that idea of Blaxploitation, right?
right. I'm teaching a class on Blaxploitation. Yeah. I have I'm having some issues, but yeah, so they're like on one hand it's like, save us, what that was the language that you use, but I don't necessarily feel that it's like, I don't feel that it's moral. I feel that it's more like driven by the economy.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. And to add to that point, I mean, about how President Obama freed the gays, at the same time, he also like applied Promesa, which was such a horrible, austerity measure that has drove the island of Puerto Rico like to, a really horrible financial situation where it's now sort of being devoured then by Americans themselves, sort of buying land, privatizing the beaches. Yeah, so it's just really interesting how there's this constant desire to sort of like target specific communities without sort of like acknowledging like the nuances and sort of the threats of connections that we all share with each other.
Right. Well, I feel like, I mean, again, it's not a reality. Like, he didn't
Yeah.
free, queer
No,
people.
totally,
Lincoln
totally.
didn't free slaves, but it's just this idea like it's products, it's kind of like this reality show where, like Oprah, like, buys a school in South Africa, and like these are her real life, subjects that, and so basically it's a different kind of slavery. So I will buy these people, they will be my subjects, I will be responsible for freeing them. I mean, it's a narcissistic endeavor. So I mean, it's just, sometimes it's moral and sometimes it advances us, but for the most part I feel like it's driven by a lot of like by capitalism. Yeah.
I wonder if at this juncture I could return to Ksenia, the particularly pitched way that you put the opposition between, let's say, setting fire to the world and saving it. And I think that each of our work in its own way is invested in that complicated placeholder term in the title, which is care, recognizing that much of what is care or goes by the name of care is in fact exploitation, narcissism, a way to sell products, continuation of cis heteropatriarchal racial capitalism. And yet there is another form of care which we could call, and as I do in my own work on the Necrocene. So that's a term that intervenes precisely in this designation of a planet on fire, a sick planet, as if it were something post-industrial or had just arrived with recent climate change, but to insist that the Necrocene begins with colonization of the New World. It begins with slavery. It begins with the disindigenation and extraction of native environments, and to insist on that, as climate scientists who coined the Orbis hypothesis do, gives us, I think, a very different orientation to. It's not that somehow things are just worse or made lethal or more lethal because one is marginalized. There is a structural force of debilitation, a making die that I'm hoping that the term Necrocene brings near. That is to put us as a scene in which we're vulnerably situated, even as we may be pitched in different ways. Nonetheless, it's a scene that we share, and to say that what would it take for us to care for what cannot be saved? That is the opposite of triage medicine. What does it take to actually work to support what cannot necessarily thrive? And thank you for putting Keon Williams in Defense of Weeds here. The amaranth in the center is dead or dying, and yet in the protective care of the gallery, and is insisting on our caring for something that cannot be made verdant again. And by analogy, what I understand the exposure, for example, of the Polaroids to do is to open up space even within the gallery, which is understood as a place often of a version of the ideal, and much of care is understood to be appropriately given toward that which can, in fact, be preserved. What does it mean to demand the care and, even custodial care of the gallery for what cannot be restored? What is written with, as Jessica Cooley puts it in her work on crypt materiality, what historically, and this is a term that emerges within the not just finance industry, but the beginnings of insurance at the dawn of the slave trade, and that is this idea that a thing or a body, and a body violently turned into a thing, might be ridden with inherent vice, and inherent vice marks as not just wrong, but somehow morally wrong, that speaks to the regime of a particular kind of compulsory fitness that is inextricable with the beginnings of colonization and the slave trade. And it's I think also that we share various, though the tactics are different, a relation to this regime of what I've been calling the photogenic, that are being not just produced by photography and its compulsory visualization, but that we somehow have to match a particular idea of the sense of the photogenic as an ableist ideal. And what would it mean to refuse that regime and its surveilling? And I think that Pamela, I don't know that this is necessarily what you're thinking about the watercolors, but I see those as really stealing the portrait away from the police sketch, away from the beginnings of a version of photographic portraiture with the police mugshot, and using it to give a particular kind of visibility. So not visibility period, but a very particular material form of visibility that's also in watercolor, so difficult to control it, and it's hard not to make connections between various waters, from the ocean to the salt of tears. And so we may be using different strategies. Yeah, please.
Right, because it reminds me of, I was showing in a class, some grids that I made for Pulse. And basically I was taking and those are all those kids that were like murdered at Pulse. And basically I had a, like, I think on the anniversary of that date, I basically they were showing a grid of all their faces. And so I did an abstraction, and also like their faces kind of like looked like thumbprints, but they were bleeding. And then and one of the teacher said, oh yeah, and that the watercolors were bleeding the way that they, you know, basically bled to death, you know. And so it was like, it was just this jarring moment of like, you know, how the sort of like the material was like replicating, you know, some of what happened. And I'm bringing up Pulse too because of like what just happened with Club Pew.
Exactly.
Thank you for raising the idea of crypt time. I think all three of you engage with that idea to a certain extent. And just for our viewers, crypt time is something that has emerged recently as a popular term from crypt theory, which essentially, I mean, Jill, you know better than me, but it draws parallels between queer theory and disability studies. And Ellen Samuels, in her essay on crypt time, writes that rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crypt time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And I mean, a few things. I would love to know how all three of you engage with this idea of time, and also queer time, of course, is something that emerges from the AIDS crisis when lives are collapsed. And also I wanted to talk more about care. And I'm increasingly becoming allergic to the term self-care. And this is not a time for a Ksenia manifesto, but I would love to, I would love for you all to speak to also in what ways you think that that strategies of care and mourning are underpinned by certain assumptions as well of what constitutes successful care and successful mourning. If that makes sense.
Well, I also think that,
Go ahead, Pamela.
yeah, I also think that we're like, you know, for purposes of the conversation, that we're like using care like in a very broad-based way. But I also feel like it's important for individuals and communities to like kind of name that care. What is care for themselves? Do you know what I mean? Like, so sometimes it's even problematic to have like that broad-based word, you know, because I feel like I'm thinking about like Rwanda, like, and there's this whole anecdote that goes around on the web that they threw out like after the massacre, that basically they threw out all the Western psychologists and stuff because they only saw care as individual, and basically the way that Rwandans, you know, kind of healed was in community, you know. And so I mean, I think that I mean, that's like a very broad description, but I do feel like that it has to narrow down that like all care is not going to look the same for, you know, each person and each community and each group, you know. And that part of like, I think part of healing is being able to define that care for yourself, you know, and what it is that you need, you know. Because like, you know, say, you know, healthcare for a person of color, you know, is really, really different in this country. And then like, you know, for a lesbian, you know what I mean? And then for poor people, you know, like, and for working class people, like, so, I mean, it's just, you know, and we have different needs. So I think also acknowledging like the levels and that each community has a right to, I mean, basically self-determination, but also self-naming, you know.
Yeah, and Pamela, I've heard you say in relation to the AIDS crisis, this was at CAA many years ago, that sometimes your way of dealing was not to deal. And that was so important for me to hear at that point, you know, as I was writing my dissertation, because exactly, sometimes, you know, sometimes not dealing is a way of dealing. And Jill, your work, you focus more on melancholy than mourning. right? And but
well, deliberately so, right? Because it's the pathologized other side. It's melancholy's the bad pathological version.
exactly,
Because
there's so much stigma around that.
And precisely because it doesn't do what is understood as the normalized successful mourning, which is to mourn and move on and get back to frankly reproduction of a particular version of the normal, which is a capitalist heteronormative normal of a particular kind of able-bodied and presumptively able-bodied productivity. So what would it mean to, for example, activate melancholy, which is also understood as lonely, depressed, chronically unable to perform? What it mean to paradoxically maybe activates not the right word, express it, which is another sense of throw out. So what would it mean to take the disposed of state are being rendered disposable and express that, return it with the force of our refusal to deal, if deal is to get back to a particular ableist, eugenic, heteronormative capitalist version of productivity. And another side, though, of crip time is lag. It's an insistence that how we might measure a version like success or the good might need an entirely different timeline. That is, how is it that we assume that something succeeds or fails on a particular normative timeline, that so much of the work that we do and have done gets disappeared by insisting that it has to pass a particular timely litmus test, that somehow until something is over, completely eradicated, or something is entirely solved, something is deemed unsuccessful. But what if we were to think crip time is also a way of understanding lag time, to understand things on slow possibility, on the small emergence, and a very different means of, frankly, measure, which also makes me think about the title carryover, Kevin. That it has many senses, but certainly one of them is its place in a history of capitalist accounting and the carryover of loss on a balance sheet. And to insist on carrying over that loss, not allowing this move into a particular profitable sublime and holding on to carrying our dead with us.
I also want to interject that, like, I'm working on a new manuscript which is called 929, and that's the amount of time that Derek Chauvin sat on George Floyd's neck. And that also, like, the solo show that I did was called About Time, and it was like the intersection of the pandemic meets the George Floyd uprising meets my father's death. And so that I think that like time and that the pandemic has created like an alternate time, and that part of our work as artists is also creating new timelines.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how I am both an artist, but I also have a full-time job in order to be able to live here and to be able to continue my own practice as an artist. And so I keep thinking about how there's this desire for for capitalism to like return to how it was before all of these events happened, and I feel like this. I keep speaking to my colleagues and saying like this could have been definitely a moment to sort of rethink our reality and sort of rethink how can we rethink you know, things like, you know, crib time, you know, and I feel that there's this desire to just go back to how everything was. And there's just almost no accountability, you know, for everything that has happened. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to like continue working. Like I think, for example, with my series, the carryover series, because and I think it was a point that Pamela said a little bit earlier on, is how we're just so constantly bombarded with so many news, with so many images, that you know, eventually, like, the crisis of one particular community are only available, you know, for the news for a week, and then it becomes history, you know. So I think as an artist, I also think about like, how can my work sort of become a reminder of things that, you know, even though um they're not, you know, on the cover of news, you know, they're still are definitely unraveling as we're speaking.
Mhm, mhm.
Right. And with the internet, like the notion of time has changed, and grief and mourning and all of those other things. So we only have that week, right? And then after that, I mean, even in terms of how a crisis is dealt with, right? It's like immediately somebody, like, you know, throws a lot of cash at it, a lot of attention. And then the people, like, these are like long-term or chronic issues. And then people are like, you know, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, they have no support. They have no, you know, no place to like talk about it. And so again, like, you know, in society, in terms of like the notion of basically immediate care versus long-term care. And that needs to be addressed, because people are just being abandoned after the first, you know, after the first week, you
Yeah.
know. And it's like, what happens, you know, what happens a year later? I mean, this is like, you know, people are still dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, you know, and like not getting their homes back and all of these
Yeah.
things. And like, you know, it only was addressed for, you know, like a year or under that, you know.
That
Mhm.
also makes me think of social media as being on its own time, you know, like a social media time.
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody has written a paper on this, but thank you all. I wanted to hold some space to also maybe highlight works by artists that are not in this conversation, and I wondered if each of you can perhaps speak to you know, another work in the exhibition that you found particularly compelling, and why.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk a little bit. I think something that was very special about this show, you know, apart from obviously, you know, being around you know, people that I have learned about and I have studied, you know, like Pamela and Jill, you know, I was also able to be near people that are part of my community, the people that I consider family, you know. So for example, the work that was next to my piece on the right is by Alex Dolores Salerno. And we both studied together at Parsons. So we kind of both have been seeing our practices have been sort of developing as time has come by. And this piece in particular, Arranged with Care, is a piece that in which she collaborates with her mom and her aunt. And they're sort of talking about a very specific recipe with a plant that is mainly from Ecuador, which is where they're from, where their mom is from. And so again, it's the Indisposable sort of acquires a different meaning, you know, that sort of like, what is it to maintain, you know, these legacies in the shapes of recipes, you know, family recipes that can sort of easily get lost and forgotten. So then Alex comes in, you know, and creates this really beautiful and very personal and intimate piece that also sort of recovers that legacy.
I love this work, and I when I picked up the pillow and the pillow says "hold me," and I picked up the pillow and I felt like I was held.
Mm-hmm.
There's something really grounding about.
Yeah,
about
and also something that I mentioned to them was just the voice, you know, hearing like the voice of their mom, the voice of their aunt, like their own voice, and you know, sort of coming and going. It was yeah, it was just really beautiful. And sort of it heightened that idea of intimacy and community.
Mhm, mhm. Pamela? I think you're muted.
Hello.
There you go.
I was saying that I had two pieces, the No Protection. What's that artist's name?
Raisa Kabir.
Yeah, I think that this piece is so powerful, and actually I've been wanting to write about it. It comes up because that idea of like no protection, I really identify with that. And I think when Lisa Kim told me about this piece, I was just gutted, because it's so resonant in so many ways, and so like, so many communities, so many people who are not protected. And so I feel that like that piece is so strong. And then also, the Black Power naps, that totally speaks to me. And, this idea of like Black people, needing rest and building in that as care, and I sort of like, I wish that a lot of this had gotten here and like, what is it, days and seconds sooner, and saved, one more. Like, I wish I had grown up with like this idea of like care, I think that, and rest for an activist and rest for Black people, because I think my life would have been very different. But anyway, so I'm appreciative of both of those works.
I think also adding to that, Pamela, because I definitely agree with you with, especially with Black Power naps, thinking of the bed as a site of resistance and thinking of the bed as like an altar. I feel like I agree with you that I wish I would have grown up with that, and not necessarily, it is just a site for you to rest until you have to wake up again and continue producing, but to sort of think of it as a site of, where ideas can be created, where a site of endless possibilities.
Rest as something active rather than passive, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Or even if it's passive, not stigmatic, something important, something to be exalted, even if it's unproductive and does nothing. It's I think also except to give pleasure, for example, joy. And I think that I would love to point to a couple of besides Pamela's beautiful funeral diva, from which Pamela read in chapter 5, Melancholy as Medium, the chapter online not this past June, but the previous June, leading up to the exhibition, still within the framework of indisposable structures of support after the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the show was initially conceived to think critically about the passage of that bill and who it doesn't protect, and what are the forces of debilitation that don't confer recognized disabilities that come with benefits and accommodation. And I'd also love to point to the new edition of Fierce Pussy's transmission, that a new edition for the first time in Braille was done for chapter 5. I did my first short film. Thank you to the Ford Foundation for a chance to do that work with that was realized by Jack Kellogg, that articulates, I saw a comment in the chat, the concept of melancholy as medium, that I do not use that term lightly. That's certainly psychoanalytically informed, but is also pressing an understanding of that term as a kind of relation that doesn't let go and works to destigmatize that not letting go, even as it's understood to erode the subject. And this marvelous new transmission for this show by the Fierce Pussy, the collective whose primary members include Joy Episale, Carrie Yamaoka, Nancy Brooks Brody, and Zoe Leonard, speaking to Crypt Time, speaks from claiming a future perfect, the state of transplendency, and speaks back to us in being transbegoggled at what we do now, that confers a different perspective on our current reality, even as it's also work that refuses to let go of the HIV/AIDS crisis, as if that's something that we've gotten over. And I'd also love to point to the book that was especially published for the exhibition by What Would an HIV Doula Do, the collective whose members, Pato Hebert and Mix Abdul Ali Muhammad, edited this really important question of what does an uprising doula do in holding space for transition, all kinds of transitions, and including the losses therein, and without a promise of what might come. And it's a beautiful takeaway. And lastly, I'd love to do a shout out to my colleague, Sammy Schalk, whose book Black Disability Politics just dropped, and whose work in the show negotiates both a fat politics and a Black queer politics, and a VOID depression, and what does it mean to work with depression in ways that are largely about joy and pleasure. And finally, I want to say that in articulating melancholy as medium, I don't understand that as opposed to joy. In fact, I would understand it as a kind of wild, off the hook joy that is quite alter to the compulsory performative happiness of I'm okay, you're okay, I'm just fine, even as I'm smiling, compulsory happiness, that openness to an enlarged range of possibility, which to go back to your earlier question, Ksenia, about the connection between theory and praxis, I would understand all the works in this show as understanding the immersion of theorization within praxis, but also a praxis that's embodied, mind very much in the vulnerable body, and not separated, that we're living our work and thinking about ways of living or dying on a dying planet that doesn't increase the damage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you, Kevin and Pamela. I am so in awe of all three of you, and so grateful for your generosity in your time and your knowledge. We're over an hour, so we should open it up to questions. But Jill, I realized we didn't show your film, so perhaps we can show the film and then transition into questions.
I'd be grateful to do that. Just it's very short. It's a minute and 12 seconds from Untitled throughout that addresses, I think, the issue head on of what it might mean to refuse particular forms of visibility from within visibility. And so I'm going to share the screen and show that brief clip. Thank you so much for letting me do that.
Where the vantage of the carefully planted and maintained gravestones admits a near view across the water to the carceral remains of Hart Island's confinement structures. Not quite registered, much less caught, in the fragile emulsion of these original Polaroids. Less image than atmosphere. Their delicate, provisional and impermanent settings hold us palpably in the low-definition, low-fidelity film of a gray-pink that shrouds the gleaming sun, of what you would never know had been a bright, sky-blue afternoon, while their textured surfaces ooze, leak, and unresolve. even come apart to disclose not just the technical glitches and even failures of exposure, but also the vibrantly weird, almost liquid stripes of deep crimson and cobalt, and the silvery rawness, even pooling void of wayward film that refuses to perform the extraction of image as data, opening instead onto material speculation, the as yet and what if of this throwaway film as spell.
Thank you. Thanks, Jill. Thank you, everyone. I feel so lucky
Thank you
to have
all.
been in conversation with all of you.
Yes, thank you. It's been incredible. So we do have a few questions. I'm going to go to our friend GE first, and you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, hi. I guess I'm wondering in a time when it seems that people are feeling heard and seen, like we're talking about, with the expansion of the media coverage and everything else, that there seems to be, and there seems to be such wonderful supportive community, and I say that in quotations, for disabled and chronically ill people. Aren't there still times though when people, and I think this show is really bringing this home, there's times when people are still terribly alone, and it seems to be that's what the show seems to be bringing home. Is there anything to this?
Yeah, I think we're trying. I don't think that the communities are always established in terms of support. I think that we're trying to build communities. I think that we're trying to build language, and that we're in the process of that. And yeah, and so yes, people are terribly alone. There's still so much like work to do. You know what I mean? This is like one show, this is one conversation. And actually I think the show and the topic is very unique, in so many ways, right? And so, and kind of like, pioneering. And so in that regard, it's the beginning of a discussion, and yeah, people, there's so much work to do. So I don't think we're at the end. I think we're at the beginning.
I think that part of it was what I was thinking of. Thank you.
Even, with 9 chapters and in gallery exhibition, this is an exhibition that should travel. This is work that, as Pamela is saying, is only just beginning, and how to find each other in that. As we started to discuss, there are ways in which disability has been so restricted, largely by a for-profit capitalist system in collusion with, insurance, such that who we would even understand ourselves to be in community is a key aspect of this CRIP, and we could say CRIP plus or CRIP asterisk critique, that it is also very much turning the critical lens on the systems that keep us lonely and separated. But yes, absolutely, only just beginning. So again, thank you, Jessica Cooley and Anne Fox and Lisa Kim for starting this. But this is a show that should travel, folks.
I just adding just to around that question. As you were posting the question, I kept thinking about how something that was not talked about a lot in the news right after the passing of Hurricane Maria was that, obviously there were a lot of deaths during the hurricane. There were a lot of deaths because of the lack of electricity, but there was also a lot of deaths because of suicide. And it was something that was definitely not talked about in the news. And I think it went back again to this idea about how, the islanders definitely galvanized, to help each other with this very immediate sort of help of like resources like water, but there was never a true moment to sort of acknowledge, all the PTSD, that all of that we all suffered, and so I think that's why, this type of conversation is definitely very important, to begin to start this, to begin community building, which I think is definitely very important.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, G, for that question. Thank you all. I'm going to go to my colleague Eleanor to ask the question on someone's behalf.
Thank you so much for this really incredible conversation. Really excited to keep thinking about all these things throughout the day and forever. But I'll be asking a question on behalf of Gabriel in the audience. I wonder if this point around group rights to self-determination could be expanded. At what points are thinking in groups useful, and at what points is it destructive?
Yeah, I don't think I could answer that like right off the top of my head. I think I would have to think about that, and I don't know that there's like a definitive answer, like I know that I think ACT UP had like a really good model, from what I can recall, in the sense that you didn't have to necessarily come to consensus, what I mean? And that people were allowed to kind of like have their own, individual thoughts, and that everybody could speak. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I think like the idea about like consensus building or not, and like, yeah, I think that has to be examined, but I don't think that we can answer it like across the board. I think it would have to be a much longer discussion.
Yeah, I agree with that, Pamela. And I think that groups are productive when there is an ability to exist across difference and through difference, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, I mean, another way to put that would be a radical distinction between the ways that we're grouped that are not at all of our choosing and may have nothing to do with the ways in which we are and understand ourselves, and the ways that we may come together and self-organize into assemblages that may be temporary or long-term, but are based on doing the work of solidarity. And we could point to, I mean, we're very close to World AIDS Day, Day with and Without Art, the theme for visual aids films that are being screening, Being and Belonging, that so much of the ways that we are and is made to feel as though we don't belong, right, that we're rendered disposable, and yet to the key aspect of what Pamela articulated so beautifully in insisting on a self-determination would be a capacity to, and claiming a capacity to determine our belonging, to forge those relations of love and a care that isn't a euphemism or a capitalist script for buying more, fill in the blank.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. I have a question actually for Kevin. When you said that you cover the face to make a reference to the collective, I think that is something that sounds maybe simple, but is very complex, especially what we're saying about maybe like a refusal to be one thing or an emptying of identity as a certain claim. But I would love to hear you expand on that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think it aligns just with my current practice, where I feel that I'm constantly sort of jumping between I call it like the macro and the micro, and I think that just comes from my background studying photography, but sort of jumping from the individual to the collective, and sort of not only thinking of my own lived experience, but also thinking of myself as a container, of multiple intersections, of multiple histories, of multiple legacies. I feel, I talk about how in my work I have, I usually like do pieces where in performance, I like lip sync the my mother's voice, and sort of think about what does it mean, to sort of inhabit that those legacies. And so yeah, I constantly am thinking about, how I am in the work I'm talking about my own lived experience, but also within the context of thinking myself as a container for multiple stories.
Okay, thank you for answering. And our just last question is going to be from our programs director, Chloe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation and incredibly inspiring conversation. My question came out of Jill's comments, but is really for all of you. Jill, I really loved hearing your thoughts on photography as a medium, and I'm wondering if you or Pamela or Kevin would like to comment on the evolution of photography and how your work or relationship with the medium, as the lines between what is photographed and what is lived increasingly blur, has changed or adjusted, thinking about the change in relationship to photography with cell phones, the currency of photography today, and this idea of the indisposable.
Well, I'm really grateful for the question. I'll keep it brief. I'll say that I'm working on a collection of essays that have been in the works for a really long time, called Photogenic. And photogenic there is that compulsory able-bodied history of from the very beginnings of photography. It was tied to biometrics and to measurement, the beginnings of photo identification. So long after we could say that photography is still necessary, we have so many other ways to identify. We still have the compulsory photo ID in that particular segment of our bodies, right, that comes from 19th century criminology, but also ethnography, and the ways that photography was used as an instrument of comparative measure in order to produce a racist version of the human, and an ableist version of the human. And thus photogenic, and besides meaning a particular idea of how one looks in a photograph and whether one looks well in it or not, it's also carries that sense, right? It was one of the first terms for photography, that William Henry Fox Talbot. So what might we think about what it means to be produced now, not by light necessarily as an agency, but we can think about that too in the wake of climate change, but also what does it mean to now be produced by photography is, thank you for using the term see, that's the way I've been describing it. I mean, now, though photography is supposedly dead, it's everywhere, and not just everywhere, it's even though this is Zoom and a video medium, there's still the retention of a particular rectangular format, which is a trace of the photographic that's now become ubiquitous. And so what are the strategies for refusing the extractive and surveilling, racializing versions of photography? So the subtitles, tactics for refusing photography. And there's so many things, of course, one can do with photochemicals besides make a photo identification or a photo ID. So that may not be the ways that you are describing your practice, Kevin, but I see some really key negotiations of the particular regime of photographic extraction in both your work and in Pamela's that feel so important. So not least that the TARP is frayed, that I think, has a sense of the unraveling of the medium that also offers an opportunity besides fixity and preservation, which is what photography supposedly promises.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for that answer.
Yes, thank you, Jill. Thank you all. Thanks for all your questions. here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and I'm so thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Phoebe Osborne, to the stage. Phoebe Osborne's works have been presented within the US and Europe, including commissions at Transmediale Berlin, La Caldera Barcelona, SF MoMA, Oakland Museum of California, and the Lensfest Center for the Arts. Osborne was a 2017 Impulsstans Dance Web recipient, and they have been a Hercules Art Studio Artist in Residence and AIR Gallery Fellow. They hold an MFA in Visual Arts from Columbia and an MA in Choreography from Das Graduate School in Amsterdam. Osborne's practice resists language of identity, nation, and culture that divide and render intimacy insentient by reorienting towards a praxis of translation, relation, and care. Thank you, Phoebe, for joining us today. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Carolyn, for introducing me, and thanks for having me today to end such a incredible and powerful conversation that's arising out of a lot of really urgent and beautiful work. So I'm honored to share a little bit of my writing. I'm going to share two excerpts of my writing, and they're both related to a fairly unrelenting excitement that I have for care and being together. And in this case, particularly in the location of the public square. Spinning became a movement I needed to train my body to feel grounded within. This training removed dizziness, activated senses that enable safety within conditions of blur and continual motion. Spinning became a practice of treading aloneness and negotiating space through producing vortex and force fields that suspend. Spinning suspends certainty, problematizes stillness as a viable orientation, disables belief in separability. Without access to visual distinction between objects, places, spaces, materials, and my own fleshy constitution, through seeing in blur, my sense mechanisms reconsider paradigms of relationality. When I spin, I can feel the temperature, movement, and humidity of air touching my skin, and the hot friction of my feet swiveling into the floor. I see light in continuous streams, learning its language as an endless horizon of color. The nearness of various topographical nuances in my surroundings are tracked by a fully activated proprioception as I revolve, not just around my own plumb line, but in a traceable orbit within the confines of the space available. My pelvis drops, an anchor to the center of the earth. My arms fling out, carving the air to propel through it. My breath sucks that same air into my lungs just to push it back out in a gaseous exchange essential to life. This sucking undulates my spine, up in the inhale and down in the exhale, a twisted verticality. The conditions of spinning undo my perception of time passing, and like my sense of space, there's a melting register of time, a sort of presence blur. Have you ever heard of a kolk? It's this underwater vortex, and they arise when rapidly rushing water passes an underwater obstacle in a boundary area of high shear. High velocity gradients generate a violently rotating column of water similar to a tornado. Kolks pluck multiple ton blocks of rock, transport them in suspension for thousands of meters. Kolks leave their marks in the form of plucked bed rock pits called Kulk Lakes and downstream deposits of gravel-supported blocks that show percussion, but no rounding. The second reading is a short story that is the story behind a dance I made in 2018. And a special little detail is that when that dance was performed in a square up in Harlem, right, it was starting and the music was playing and the audience were kind of around. And actually in the video footage, something that is really touching to me is that before the dancers started to move, Pamela just was there and I don't think realized the dance was starting, and she entered the square and she walked across it, and it like gives me chills, and I always felt like this kind of blessing or like sense of joy and power and gratitude for her like mark in this dance. The dance was called Lion. In 2018, I had been regularly feeding pigeons down by the Hudson River at 125th Street on the west side of Harlem. One sunny day in February, there weren't any around, and I stood there alone at the water feeling kind of stupid with my seeds in my hand. But in the distance, I saw this brick building over by Broadway, and it was just being bathed in sunlight. And along the edge of the building were about 50 pigeons. So I walked toward them. And sure enough, as I arrived, they swarmed around me, feasting, very pleased by my arrival. And shortly thereafter, someone popped out of the parking garage that occupied this brick building. This was Frank, an Indian man with a warm smile, similar in stature to Mario from Super Mario Brothers. Frank also held pigeon food in his hands. He smiled and joined me in casting food into the air. Frank managed the parking garage, and in the months that followed, we became good friends. He feeds these pigeons 4 times a day, a whole bag of puffed wheat each time. Frank explained to me the importance of supporting life. Because life is all the same, he told me. It's an intelligent collective force that's inseparable, he said casually. Frank believed that by supporting the life around us, we support our own life. When Frank feeds the pigeons, he often belts out a word I could never recognize. Something like, shallow! Weeks passed and I never really questioned it. But eventually I couldn't help myself and I said, Frank, what are you saying? Cheryl? Sharon? I asked. And he laughed at me. And he said, no, Charo, Charo. And then he gestured with his arms like one might embody a bulldog, carving and flexing his arms and fists around and below his chest. Lion, that's their name. I named them Lion because they are strong. Thank you, guys.
Beautiful.
Wow, Phoebe, that was just so great. Thank you. And thank you, of course, Pamela and Kevin and Jill and Ksenia. We would also like to thank Lisa Kim and the Ford Foundation for helping today. Do go see the show if you haven't. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rails YouTube channel as it has been recorded. And for the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through a monthly publication and public events like here on our daily NSE. This holiday season, help us sustain our work and reach our goal of raising $150,000 this month towards the Rails writers, editors, and operations. Your support will help keep our issues and events free. You can donate via the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for the Subterranean Affiliations of the Trees, a poetry reading curated by Zoe Tuck. And you can now turn your microphones on and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
So
much.
great to
Thank
be
you.
with you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
Thank
Shout
you.
out Lisa Kim, Jessica
Thank
Cooling,
you.
and Pod.
That was amazing. Thank you.
And Janie
So good.
Kohenik.
Jill
Thank
Casid.
you.